Welcome to Beyond the Crucible. I'm Warwick Fairfax, the founder of Beyond the Crucible.
I got less and less mobile, could barely walk around the block, and I'm somebody that, 6 months earlier had been running 7 or 8 miles on a Saturday just for fun, because I thought that was fun. Dragging myself up the stairs by the banister, basically, using my arms to get myself up because I just wasn't necessarily the strength, but I just couldn't make my legs do completely what they needed to do to get up the stairs. And so that was the beginning of a couple of year period that was pretty rough.
From that pretty rough start of his life living with multiple sclerosis, Scott Eblin has turned his trial into triumph by retraining his body and his mind to continue pursuing a vision of coaching and empowering leaders to create great outcomes for their organizations, families, and communities. Key to his bounce back from his crucible, he tells Warwick, has been practicing yoga and mindfulness. What he's discovered through them has helped him build better leaders who lead better lives and in turn help create a better world.
So Scott, welcome to Beyond the Crucible. Wonderful to have you here. We've met before. It was at an International Coach Federation conference in Washington, D.C. quite a few years ago now. I believe you were speaking. We had a round table, literally a round table, and you talked a bit about the backstory, which you write in your book. And so I got the book then, and here it is, Overworked and Overwhelmed. And you very kindly signed it for me. So I've got a signed copy, which very much appreciate that. And we're going to get into your book, Overworked and Overwhelmed, here in a moment. And we're going to get into your backstory first. But just to give people an idea, Scott's a globally recognized executive coach. He's spoken all over the world. In fact, named by, I think it's 50, as one of the most influential coaches and global gurus. It's one of the top coaches. We're going to be talking about Scott's book, Overworked and Overwhelmed, The Mindfulness Alternative. But there is another book that Scott wrote, The Next Level, What Insiders Know About Executive Success. So you're a very accomplished speaker, author, and coach. And we're going to talk again about really the concept of mindfulness in your book, Overworked and Overwhelmed. But tell us a bit about your growing up and whether kind of threads of how you grew up that led to your life's work and really coming alongside leaders and trying to help them maybe be sane and on purpose rather than, sort of rats on a treadmill, if you will. So any threads about your background that led to what you do now?
Yeah, I think there are, actually. I grew up in Huntington, West Virginia, which is was a large town when I grew up, and it is now a small town. It's been a victim of the Rust Belt. It's probably best known for Marshall University these days. And if people have seen the Matthew McConaughey movie, We Are Marshall, it is really representative of a pivotal moment in my childhood. There was a plane crash with the Marshall football team and a lot of their supporters in 1970, to November 1970. And everybody was, died in that crash just outside of Huntington at Tri-State Airport. And my mom and dad were big Marshall supporters, always were throughout their lives. And my dad had tickets to go on that trip and was very excited to go with a bunch of friends, him and my mom, Judy. And my dad was a dentist, and he had a patient book on Saturday mornings back then. And my mom said, "You've got patients on Saturday, and I don't like to fly anyway. We're not going." And so he was pretty mad. And, but that was we had a number of close friends of theirs, kids I went to church with and so forth, who lost parents. And of course, they're mainly players and staff of that place. So that was like, diving right into the crucible moments. I mean, that was a crucible moment for the community. I mean, it's over 55 years now since that occurred. And every November the 14th, there's a memorial service in Huntington. My parents are buried just beyond the grave site where the folks who couldn't be identified are buried. It's the Marshall Memorial and Cemetery that overlooks the city and the campus. And so, yeah, a big moment. But back to your main question, I probably relate most of what I do today to the childhood experience of being a Boy Scout. To be honest, my grandfather was a scoutmaster back in the early '60s, I guess late '50s and early '60s, and I just idolized my grandfather. He had this spiffy uniform and a Smokey the Bear hat, and he was seemed like always going on trips to Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico, and I wanted to be like him, and I was really fortunate later in life to spend a lot of time with him one-on-one in his last 10 or 15 years of life. But back then I didn't see as much of him. They lived out of town, but I really wanted to be like him. And so I got into Cub Scouts at an early age and kind of stayed with it all the way through Eagle Scout, in my high school years. And I'm a pack rat. And several years ago, I was going through plastic crates of stuff that I had saved, trying to, reduce the number of plastic crates. What could I get rid of? And I came across a binder, a loose leaf binder for a program that I was in the pilot group for when I was probably 15 or 16 called Troop Leadership Development. And I started flipping through this notebook and I just kind of had this, oh my gosh, kind of experience. I said, this is everything I've been doing for the rest of my life. It was all this stuff about facilitation skills and how to ask good questions. And, the Scouts have had a tough run for sure, and in many ways deservedly so in the last, however many years, 10 to 20 years. But at its core, that's a heck of an organization as a leadership development organization now for boys and girls. But when I was, and it was Boy Scouts and it was boys. And I realized then that, I make a joke in some of the programs that I do for leaders, introduce yourself kind of thing. And one of the questions I learned from Pat Lencioni was, what's your greatest childhood challenge? And my answer is always anything involving a ball and a stick. Because when I grew up in Huntington, little boys, it was all about sports, and what sport you played, baseball or basketball or whatever. And I kind of sucked, frankly, at all of that. And so I sort of gravitated towards leadership kind of stuff, starting with Scouts and then student council and Key Club and church youth groups and whatever else. And as I became older and started working, in different organizations, government, nonprofit, private sector. Generally, I ended up working directly for the most senior person. This was like when I was in my 20s and early 30s. And whether it was a CEO and chairman of the bank holding company or the president of the gas pipeline company that hired me in as part of her senior team. And I just had the governor of West Virginia for a couple of years. I worked for him and at that time. And I just had a lot of exposure early to really senior leaders and what it was like for them. And then I eventually, for a brief period of time, became a senior leader myself, as a member of an executive team, a couple of executive teams. And that, that was kind of it. But when I got into coaching and I left my last corporate job to start the coaching business with my wife, Diane, 25 years ago, I always viewed it as the intersection of leadership development and strategy. And strategy could either be macro or micro, organizational or personal. And I still think of coaching in many ways like that. That's leadership, strategy, intersection. Think about it in other ways too now, but that was how I started. And again, a lot of the leadership development practice and theory and tools and everything else probably started in Scouts.
So talk about sort of pre-Crucible, which I guess was 2009. What was life like for Scott Eblin pre-Crucible? You're working probably lots of hours, climbing up the corporate ladder, having great success. What was the pre-2009, pre-Crucible Scott Eblin like in your life and business life?
Type A, thought I was bulletproof, thought of myself, if you ask me, like, who are you? It's kind of a deep question, but one of my first answers would have been, I'm a runner. I started running, not competitively, I'm, again, ball and stick, but I started running competitive for myself, like when I was 12 or 13. because it was something I actually could do athletically, put one foot in front of the other. And really enjoyed it. Got a lot of physical benefit from it. Got a lot of mental benefit from it. And with running, I view it as a very linear kind of sport. I mean, you're kind of running from one place to another, point A to point B usually. And there's a book way back when, The Complete Book of Running by Jim Fixx, that really influenced me. And one of the things that Jim Fixx wrote about in that book was, how do you keep going when you want to quit? And one of the techniques for a distance runner, which is kind of what I like to do, is to pick a spot just ahead, a couple of 100 yards ahead, that telephone pole. I'm going to run to that telephone pole, and then I'll decide whether I want to keep running or not. Well, by the time you get to the telephone pole, you've picked another spot. I'm going to run up to that mailbox. When I get to that mailbox 200 yards ahead, I'll decide again. You keep deciding and deciding and deciding, and eventually you've finished, right? And so that persistence and that doggedness that Jim Fixx promoted, and as I remember it, at least in that book, was really a lot of my self-identity. And I think I applied that, just put your head down, keep going, don't give up kind of mentality to pretty much everything I did. It's funny, I mentioned my parents at the outset, and my mom died last year, which may be something we want to talk about or not, but because my dad died about 6 years ago now, in 2019. And I, through incredible good fortune, I think, it was a sad event, but I was very fortunate we lived in California at the time. My parents were still in West Virginia, and my dad was declining in health. And I could see that I needed to be back in West Virginia as much as I could be in the year 2019, when I traveled for business trips from the West Coast to the East Coast. And first time I was able to do that was the first week of April, a weekend. Parents met me at Tri-State, the airport I mentioned, and we went to dinner that evening, had a lovely dinner together. My dad had told me in advance, because I've got an outpatient procedure the next morning on Friday, but it shouldn't be a big deal. We'll just continue on. Great. Well, that started late, ran late. By 5 o'clock, he was out. So that was all day Friday. Doctor said, well, given his health history, I want to admit him overnight. Very long story short, he had a septic shock episode. Blood pressure crashed, never recovered from it, really. Was conscious for most of that period, but was on all the machines in the last several hours, and passed away at 11:30 Saturday night. And then when I'd gotten there on Thursday night. So then you go into funeral mode, and I was nominated to give the eulogy by the rest of the family. And my two sons, who are adults now, my brother and I went out and got a beer together and just started talking about my dad and their granddad and my brother's dad. And one of them brought up, I think it was my brother, brought up my dad, who was a really great dentist and a perfectionist at that, and his patients loved him. But he always used to like to say, if you're going to do something, do it right. Don't half-ass it. And so with that First United Methodist Church in Huntington, that was the theme of my eulogy from the pulpit, was don't half-ass it, which I'm not, I worked a little bit blue that day, but I think it was okay. It's PG-13 maybe. Yeah. And that mindset, I'm sure, informed, how I thought of myself prior to 2009 as well, was, don't half-ass it, do it right, keep going, don't give up, put your head down, keep grinding.
Let's jump to 2009. And so you were this kind of hardworking, there's no obstacle I can't overcome. I'm a runner, work your way up. I can work anybody else under the table. You didn't say that, but I'm guessing you worked as hard as anybody that you knew, I would guess. So 2009 happened, and my guess is probably your book, Overworked and Overwhelmed, wouldn't have got written without that. So talk about 2009, why that was the origin of your book and how that transformed your whole life.
So 2009, in the spring of 2009, I was out running, as I always was. And I noticed progressively in the first months of that year that my legs felt really heavy. just like no resilience or spring in them, just like lead. And it was completely different than anything I'd ever experienced. And I'd had injuries before, but this wasn't that. It was like chronic and had no explanation for what it was. And so back then WebMD was the big thing, and you're always jumping on WebMD to self-diagnose. These days you do it on ChatGPT, I guess, but back then it was WebMD. And so I got on WebMD like all good type A's to self-diagnose. And my self-diagnosis was lumbar stenosis. And then I started saying, okay, who treats lumbar stenosis? Googling that. And it's a specialty called a physiatrist, which is kind of I think it's the intersection of orthopedics and neurology, if I got that right. I don't remember exactly. So anyway, I worked through my primary doctor to get an appointment with a physiatrist and I walked into her office and I almost immediately said, I'm pretty sure I have lumbar stenosis. I just need you to tell me what to do to fix it. And she laughed. She said, well, thanks for the help, but why don't we look at it a little more deeply, Mr. WebMD, Dr. WebMD. And she ordered some MRIs, and the MRIs showed that I had lesions on my spine and in my brain. And that's an indicator of MS. Multiple sclerosis. It's the first time I mentioned that was multiple sclerosis. And then the next step in the diagnostic process back then was to go to a neurologist and have a spinal tap done, which actually isn't as painful as it, I think, is advertised. It's not that big a deal. It wasn't for me, at least. And they run tests on the fluid they draw from your spine. And if there's certain kinds of proteins, I think it is in that fluid, and you've got lesions in your spine, that's pretty much 100% confidence that you have multiple sclerosis. And what's interesting about it, and I don't know whether it was psychosomatic or whether it was just coincidental, but it's funny. The day I went back to get the MRI results, my second visit with the physiatrist, I noticed that when I was walking across the parking lot, I couldn't feel my feet making contact with the ground. And I know now that was peripheral neuropathy. That's what it's called, peripheral neuropathy. And so, the extremities of your nervous system, your hands, your feet, quite often are the first things to kind of go in MS because your nervous, the lesions in your spine, you can always think of it as like cable, back when we still had cable TV, cable television, coaxial cable. If you shave the plastic coating back, the wires underneath that coating and the cable are exposed. Well, your nervous system has cables, so to speak, and there's the plastic sheath is called the myelin sheath, and the myelin in MS degrades, and it exposes the nerve. It makes the neural pathways, it's harder for them to transmit the signal cleanly. And so your feet, your hands, whatever, don't work the right way, right? And so from that point on, from that diagnosis period through the rest of 2009 was just like down and to the right in terms of my capabilities. I got less and less mobile, could barely walk around the block. And I'm somebody that, 6 months earlier had been running 7 or 8 miles on a Saturday just for fun because I thought that was fun. And, dragging myself up the stairs by the banister, basically using my arms to get myself up because I just wasn't necessarily the strength, but I just couldn't make my legs do completely what they needed to do to get up the stairs. And so that was the beginning of a couple of year period that was pretty rough.
I think I read that there was like a multiple sclerosis drug that may work for some, but it just didn't work for you. I think it almost shut down your liver. So here is this hope. Take this drug and it'll help you. And it's like, it's not helping me. It's really,
it's funny. It's such an odd coincidence that we're speaking today because I had a conversation a couple of hours ago with the newly named, about 6 months ago, CEO of the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. Really great guy named Tim Coatsey. And Tim and I have talked a couple of times in the last year or two, and he is a reader of my blog, which is how we've got connected. And had a lovely conversation with him, and we were talking this morning about how much things have changed in the 15 years since I was 16 years now, since I was diagnosed. And when I was diagnosed, usually there wasn't much hope. There was only one class of drug. There's a class of drugs called beta-serons, which really aren't used anymore, as I understand it. It's really hard to get into a specialist for MS. We lived in the DC area at the time, and just through dogged persistence, mainly on the part of my wife, Diane, I was accepted into a trial at Johns Hopkins. And Johns Hopkins at the time may still, I don't know, had just a world-class MS study center with a doctor who was a world-renowned MS expert specialist guy. So I got into this study for a drug that was coming off patent. And one of the ways you keep a drug on patent is to change the formulation in some way. And so they were trying to make the dosage like twice as strong. And instead of having to take it weekly or a couple of times a week or whatever it was, you could take it once every 2 weeks. And what was happening with me being on that drug, I knew for sure I wasn't getting the placebo, because every time I injected it, I would feel worse than I did the time before, to the point where I would have to be on the couch for, 2 or 3, 4 days. And meanwhile, we're trying to run a coaching business where I'm running around all over the place, working with clients, giving speeches. The Next Level book that you mentioned had come out, and I was very much in the mode of promoting that book constantly, because we'd built our business around the content of that book. And so one of the things we did, which in retrospect wasn't such a smart thing to do, was we didn't tell anybody I had MS, because, we didn't want to raise any concerns. I'm not going to show up. And I had an opportunity, first opportunity I ever had to work with General Electric back when GE was still GE, was up in Schenectady, New York at GE Power, it was back then. And I said to Diane, I'm going to be giving that speech holding the cane, because I'm not sure I could stand up to give it, but I had to go because my first shot with GE, right? And I didn't use a cane, but I stayed within 2 feet of the podium the entire time, because I'm usually like a wander around guy. But I just felt like I need to have something to grab if I start losing my legs, which happened all the time. And so that stress of keeping it secret and worrying about, am I going to be able to perform today? Like literally perform. That was big. The drug itself was big. And the other thing it does, that class of drugs did, at least with me, I mean, there are always side effects with any drug, right? And so drugs can be great, and they can really just change your life in a positive way. And I think you need to be really aware of what the side effects are and pay attention to that.
So for you, obviously, this drug might be helpful to some, but wasn't to you. But
yeah,
it seems like the game changer for you was yoga. So talk about... I mean, people are familiar with yoga for stretching, and a lot of people don't know a huge amount about it's more than stretching. From what I understand, there's a spiritual component. So talk about how yoga transformed your health and maybe more. It was a game changer, in which I'm sure if you searched WebMD, you have MS, try yoga. I'm guessing it's wasn't on the WebMD site back then.
It wasn't as known back then there, and I wish I'd pulled it out before we started to talk, but there's a book, well, I'll get to that in a second. A friend of Diane's, and so this is how I got to yoga. A friend of Diane's is a multi-degree health expert, master's degrees, PhDs, and she's a yoga instructor. And she had said to Diane, I don't know, 4 or 5 months after I was diagnosed and really struggling with everything, so Scott should do yoga. So I teach it to people with multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease, and I have terrific outcomes with them. And Diane's kind of like pushing me to do yoga. And I said, well, that's really a cool idea, that I can barely walk around the block. How am I going to do yoga? And so I really was resistant to that. And there was a studio close to our house in Herndon, Virginia at the time, called Down Dog Yoga. It was the closest studio. Well, that was also a hot yoga studio, and I've since learned an extremely hot yoga studio. I mean, they cranked it up in there. But so not necessarily recommending hot yoga if you're an MS person, you're just starting out. But that's what I did, because it kind of fit my type A thing, I guess. But I said to the instructor that first night, I said, I quite confidentially I have MS and I need you to keep that secret, but I just want you to know in case like something happens, that's what's going on with me. So that's okay. We have people like you here all the time. And here's the deal I'll make you. If you come here 3 days a week, it'll change your body. If you come here more than 3 days a week, it'll change your life. And so I started going more than 3 days a week. And the physical impact of that was kind of amazing. Within 2 or 3 months, I was doing wheel pose, which little kids can do easily, but it's that kind of upside down push up that you do, with your hand. You're laying on your back, your hands are behind you. You kind of prop yourself up on your feet, and then you do a push up, right? And it took me 2 or 3 months to get to the point where I could do that. But I started doing that, and they were very headstand oriented in that studio. I started working on doing headstands and crash and burn like a NASCAR driver. I mean, I just, I was would wipe out. I would always make sure I was in a spot where if I fell over, I was going to take out 2 or 3 other students. I had some massive wipeouts, but I just kept doing it. And then I started going, like I said, more than 5 days a week, and it just starts sinking in on you. And it's a big reason I wrote the Overworked and Overwhelmed book, because most books, it's write what you know. And I'd had this life experience where I started doing the research for the book. I think I knew I wanted to share what I'd learned so far, but in doing the research for the book, one of the things I learned was rhythmic repetitive movement is really key in activating your parasympathetic response. And so everybody knows what fight or flight is. That's your sympathetic response, and that's a protective mechanism, to save you from danger, physical danger, get you out of there, or fight if you have to. What I've learned over the years, everybody's heard of fight or flight. Very few people have heard of rest and digest, which is the nickname for the parasympathetic response. And the two are designed to work together like the gas pedal and the brakes in a car. Fight or flight's the gas pedal, rest and digest is the braking system. And they should work in what clinicians would call homeostasis, a state of balance between the two. And what's really interesting about it is you can't consciously choose to activate fight or flight. It just sort of happens, when there's a stimulus that activates your amygdala and in conjunction with the thalamus, and you kind of spring into fight or flight mode. You can actively choose to activate your rest and digest response. And one way to do it is through rhythmic repetitive motion, like deep breathing, like yoga, like Tai Chi, like a good walk around the block, lifting weights, I guess. I mean, repetitive prayer, chanting. I mean, there's a lot of interesting physical and spiritual traditions. One of the things I learned when I went to yoga teacher training in 2013 is there's 8 limbs of yoga. Okay. This goes way back, to Patanjali, thousands of years ago. And the first 2 are kind of rules of living. Yama and niyamas is what they're called. But the next one is called the asana. I think I've got this right. And the asana is the physical part of yoga, whatever, like warrior 2 pose or whatever. And everybody thinks about that when they think of yoga. But the next one is called pranayama, and that's the breath, right? And the breath, a lot of people would tell you, is more important than the physical movement. And so between the two, the rhythmic repetitive motion of the movement, and especially a flow type of yoga routine where you're flowing from one pose to the next, and the breathing work that you're doing, because every in a well-instructed yoga class, every movement is tied to the breath in a really direct way, and you breathe in, breathe out as you're doing this or that. Well, it's just a massive activation of your parasympathetic response. And one of the things I realized with my own MS was when I was stressed and in fight or flight, I felt worse, physically felt worse. My mental capabilities weren't as clear. Nothing was as good. When I was less stressed, I felt better physically and mentally and emotionally and everything else. And so that's one reason I started going to yoga every day, was just because it was like this, it was the medicine, and so that's how that got started.
Yeah. So there are different techniques, but it comes under the tent of being mindful and not being like a little, mouse in a treadmill, which really gets to some of the keys in your book. I mean, you start out really talking about so many sort of gung-ho executives were like you pre-2009. It's like, I can get through anything. I can, no obstacle is too big. I just have to work hard. But yet there's not a whole lot of mindfulness. They're not really considering, well, is what I'm doing makes sense? What's the purpose of what I'm doing? Being on my little treadmill. Does it make sense to have a weekend? Does it make sense to have a break? Should I be working 24 hours a day on vacation while my family's enjoying themselves, but I'm with them, but I'm not with them, if you will. So just talk about the whole concept of mindfulness, which makes sense to you and me, but to your average 24-hour gung-ho executive, it's a foreign language.
Yeah, I think it can be. I really try in my work to make things as simple as possible. And one of the ways I think about mindfulness, and I talk about this in the book, I think you can, John Kabat-Zinn may agree or disagree, any of the mindfulness, experts and gurus. I'm not one, but I think of mindfulness as kind of being equivalent to awareness plus intention. And awareness, I think, operates in two domains. There's awareness of what's going on around me, but also awareness of what's going on inside of me, usually in reaction or response to what's going on around me. The external environment triggers, for good or for bad, different responses or reactions inside of us, mentally, physically, emotionally. So that's the awareness piece. And then once I'm aware, or more tuned in, I have the opportunity to be intentional about what I'm going to do next, or maybe more importantly, what I'm not going to do next, because there's always way more to do than there is time to do it. So given what I'm trying to accomplish in my life, in my family, in my work, this week, today, kind of short term, what's the most important thing for me to do next? Based on hopefully an enhanced level of awareness around my external and my internal operating environments.
I know for me, if I get angry or frustrated, sometimes I won't know why. I'm probably like you. I hate not knowing why. I think you quote Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living, or what have you. I'm with that. So if it's a personal thing, I'll talk to Gail, my wife, and I'll say, look, I'm feeling angry and frustrated, but I'm not even sure why. So we'll talk about it for a bit. Pretty soon we'll figure it out. She knows me well. Is it this? Is it that? A bit like a doctor, if you will. Once I figure it out, again, for me, then I'll say, can we pray? And I might say to my wife, can you pray for me? And once I do that, 9 times out of 10, I'm feeling a whole lot better. And I'll often have an idea, okay, what is it I need to do next? Do I need to talk to somebody? You just need to think differently. So
I want to jump in, Scott, and I want to ask, because you define mindfulness, as Warwick said, in a very interesting way. Part of it, you said, is what's going on inside of you, inside of me. And I found an article that you were interviewed in, and you said something really interesting that really applies to folks who listen to and watch Beyond the Crucible, because it's something that you can do after you've gone through a crucible experience of any stripe. And you said this, take a moment each day to notice and celebrate one positive step you've taken, right? That seems like a perfect bit of counsel and wisdom to give to somebody who's just gone through something difficult, some setback or failure, some trial. And I think it applies, right, to pretty much any kind of thing like that. Not just those things, but certainly would apply to any kind of crucible one would have, right?
Mm-hmm. Totally. It's related to the Japanese concept of Kaizen, incremental improvement through small steps. There's a great John Wooden quote, the former basketball coach at UCLA a million years ago now, about I'm paraphrasing, but little steps when consistently taken lead to big things. It's the basic idea of the quote. And I probably internalized that from my yoga practice, right? Because like I said, the studio I went to, and then we moved to LA, in 2012. We were there from 2012 through 2021. And prior to COVID, LA was like best place in the world, maybe outside of India, to do yoga. I mean, like they had the greatest teachers ever in LA. I mean, there's crazy, the people I got to take classes from out there. And so you learn a lot of stuff, you learn a lot of yoga tricks, so to speak. But at least with me, again, back to ball and stick, I'm not a natural at that stuff, but I would just keep trying it and trying it and trying, like, tripod headstand in Northern Virginia when I was wiping out. It probably took me 6 months to be confident enough to do that in the middle of the room without a wall beside me. The regular headstand, even longer. My big project in Los Angeles was handstands. I worked on handstands for 3 or 4 years before I could. I still like to have a wall close by because I don't want to like topple over, but just to even get up and hold it took forever. But little bit, all of a sudden you're doing it. Well, how'd that happen? Well, it's because you just did it a little bit forever, and eventually you got there. So another way to say what we were just talking about, progress comes incrementally than suddenly, and sometimes you're making such a small amount of progress, you can't even discern you're making it, but you're making it. You just don't recognize it. And then all of a sudden, one day you're doing it. I think I call it the 5% solution. You're like, if you get 5% better consistently over time, pretty soon you're 20, 30, 40, 60, 70% better, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's really hard in life to solve for 100, in business and life in general, to solve for 100% on any given day. It's just like, you don't know enough. You don't have enough experience. You don't have enough bandwidth. You don't have enough resources. It takes time, right? And the yoga practice taught me that for sure, reinforced that.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. One of the other big things you talk in your book, and I think really in your whole practice, is the life GPS. And, I love some of those questions. Like there's a great question which you ask, how are you when you're at your best? And there are sub-questions underneath there, and you break down routines. It's funny. As I think I mentioned, I'm a big routine and rhythm person. It's just the way I'm wired. And it works for me. Obviously, over the years and decades, I've got physical, spiritual. I mean, I've got things I like to relax with. I mean, I'm a reflective person. I like my rhythms, for better or worse. And now that I've read your book, maybe for the better. So
well, you knew that already.
Probably, but anyway, it works for me. Anyway, so you break it down, the routines into physical, mental, relational, spiritual. So talk about why this life GPS is so profound, and where do you want to go? Because a lot of people, they live life not on purpose, but on some like ladder. Oh, why do you want to be CEO? Well, it's just everybody else wants to. You've heard the whole analogy of the anthill. It's like, where are the other ants going? I don't know, but it must be good because they're all climbing somewhere. And again, this is not my, somebody else has used that. But we can be like that. There's no on purpose. It's just, I'm doing what every other guy, what every other woman's doing. So talk about what life GPS is and why that's such a game changer for any human.
So I thought we might get into this. So I got my little folder here that has my own life GPS in it that I carry around with me and look at several times a week, generally. So it basically, if you go to our website, eblingroup.com, you can get an editable PDF and you can type it in just like I did. If you're a total life GPS geek. 3 questions. How are you at your best? Which I describe that as the short list of words that describe you when you're in your own version of peak performance mode, whatever that looks like for you. My wife and I came up with this model, going on 30 years ago, probably, when we had young kids, and life was crazy in that unique way that it can be when you have young kids and you're trying to establish your career and everything. And I'd read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People like 4 or 5 times at that point, loved it, but couldn't really figure out how to operationalize it. Diane had read it a couple of times. And so we just sat around in this little attic office we had in our house back then, a couple of weekends, just saying, okay, if you wanted to dummy this down, like make it simple, what would you do? How would you get this on one page so you can act on this stuff? And so we came up with those 3 questions. How are you at your best? What are the routines and the domains you mentioned, physical, mental, relational, and spiritual, that if you followed them could help you be more at your best consistently? And then finally, what outcomes would you hope or expect to see in what I would argue are the 3 big arenas of life: your life at home, your life at work, and your life in your community, however you define community. That's kind of unique to each person. And so they hang together, and it becomes a reference point. Like I think of the words, like my words, and they evolve over time, but this has been pretty consistent for the last few years for me. Calm, clear, connected, creative, loving, and fun. Those are the 6 words, I guess, that describe me at my best. And I think of it like, you've got a phone with Google Maps on it or whatever, and some GPS app, Apple Maps, whatever it is. Your phone, through the magic of the satellites up there in geosynchronous orbit and the GPS system, somehow iterating back and forth in ways that I don't fully understand, but referencing a precise, very precise to the, nth decimal point, latitude and longitude of where you are at this moment, the latitude and longitude of where you want to go, and every point along the way to redirect your route if you take a wrong turn. I think of those words, calm, clear, connected in my case, as the latitude and the longitude. And I can look at that and say, how am I doing? Am I showing up this way today? Well, I wrote about this recently in my blog, Let Your Words Be Your Guide this year. At the beginning of the year, I wrote this post, like a practice that I've adopted over the last couple of years is not every day, but 2 or 3 days a week. I'll meditate in the morning just on my words. What does it mean to be calm today? And like, I think about what's coming up on the calendar, might challenge me in terms of being calm, or what does it mean to be clear? What are all the different permutations of being connected, and how might that play out today, play out this week? And really just kind of dwell in that a little bit. And it's kind of a clarifying thing. It's a great thing to do before you journal, and kind of, because it's a good thought starter. The routines, ideally, I think, should be ones that help me show up that way in those 4 domains: physical, mental, relational, and spiritual. And then there's this great quote I found in the period where I wrote Overworked and Overwhelmed from Gandhi. It's his foreword or afterword, I don't remember which, to the Bhagavad Gita, was, the sacred Hindu text. And in regard to every action, one must know the result that is expected to follow. So it's not to say that if I don't get that outcome or I don't get that result, I failed and I should beat myself up over that. It's just like, notionally, what am I expecting? What am I hoping for? What direction do I want this to go in, or do I hope it goes in at work or at home? And just being intentional about the actions, the actions that flow from being at your best. And again, it's a reference point. I quite often look at the outcomes that we have a retreat, Diana and I do every fall in October or November. We spend a weekend doing fun stuff too, because we're not total geeks, but spend several hours working on our life GPS individually, and then we'll compare notes and kind of, help each other be honest with ourselves. And so do it once a year and refresh it and kind of fine tune it in that period of the year. And then for 2025, I've got it, right? And so, am I staying true to what I said was going to be important back in November? And if I'm not, why not? Is it just because I'm not paying attention, or maybe my picture has changed? You're allowed to edit it and adjust it, but do it with some level of awareness and intention, some mindfulness to it.
Yeah, I can't recommend what you're saying too much. It's just, it's been a while since I read the book the first time. I read it again just in preparation for our discussion, and it makes so much sense. And amazingly, maybe it was in my head subconsciously, but I do a lot of what you're saying.
Do you really? How do you do it? What's your process?
Because I'm reflective, I know that I'm a reflective advisor, and being Australian, I have a bit of a different cultural upbringing than America. So in Australia, nobody works 24 hours a day. They're thought of as idiots. You know, even if you work for an investment bank or a law firm, you'll probably leave by 7 or 8. That's called like half a day in a New York investment bank or New York law firm, you know, that's half time. So, and I'm somebody that when I do something, I give it 100%.
You don't half-ass it.
No, it's not part of my DNA.
Yeah.
And maybe that's from my mother, I don't know. But yet I believe on vacation, yes, I might check email once in a while, but being on vacation, we went on a ski trip a few weeks ago to Big Sky because my kids and my wife love skiing. I'm not as good as they are, but they're all very good, but I do it because the family loves it. So yeah, when I'm at my best, I'm a reflective person. So I'm thinking, you know, what I'm going through. Gee, I guess that could be a blog or a podcast. And the other thing is, I'm going to be writing about this soon, is just design a life that makes sense for me. So we did a thing with the Beyond the Crucible team recently. And since I'm the founder and it's kind of my thought leadership, the first subject of our virtual summit was, what does Warwick want? How can you possibly start a summit like that? It sounds so egotistical, but since this is my brand, it's like, well, what do I want in life? And I mentioned, I love what I do, but I'm an elder at my, non-denominational evangelical church. I've got a community group, life group. There's a couple of committees. So it's rewarding, but I love what we do. My kids all went to a Christian university in Indiana, at Taylor University. I'm on a campaign committee there that meets virtually every once in a while and in person. I mean, there's a number of things I do in life, all of which I'm very passionate about. Only one of which is Beyond the Crucible. I love what I do,
right,
but I love these other rhythms I have. And I have adult kids like you. I want to be able to spend time being with them and my wife. We have a place in northern Michigan where we go to in the summer. So I have my rhythms and I get to choose my own adventure. I get to design my life the way I want to.
Yeah.
And so that's it, the big picture. And then I have my, whether it's walking, cycling, prayer. I've got, before more than you need to know, but this is all part of my rhythm. Before I go to bed, I've got a bunch of scriptures that I kind of go over, and I have my acrostic that I do typically. Most people of faith would be familiar with ACTS, which is adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication, which is prayer. That's sort of like a mantra, if you will, sort of go through that. Obviously, being thankful is a huge part of that. So, yeah, I've got the rhythms that I do, and I like to have space where I'm not just running like a crazy person, because for me to be a reflective advisor, I need to have time to reflect.
Yeah.
So I've got my rhythms. And so there are things I don't do as much. I don't run around speaking. I've been trained. I'm not a born speaker, but I think I got to the point where I'm relatively, if not pretty effective. But I don't need to do that. So I don't do that much because I don't really enjoy it. I don't want to be traveling all over. It gets in the way of all the other things I want to do with church, and Taylor and my kids went. So anyway, more than you need to know, but it's like I want to design my life that fits with my purpose and the rhythms I have. And if something needs to be done, I can go into full blown, get it done, go 5 or 6 hours without eating. I can do all that. Mm-hmm. But I choose not to use that gear unless it's absolutely necessary.
Well,
anyway.
You must be very clear on what you find fulfilling, right?
Absolutely.
Because it's very tempting, as somebody who used to speak a lot. And then when COVID happened, I was doing it on Zoom, but wasn't jumping on planes most every week.
Right.
And I went through withdrawal, right? Because I missed the applause, like literally missed the applause. And then all of a sudden I said, wow, it's so much better actually to stay home or stay home more frequently, because I feel better. I'm not exhausted all the time from all the time zones and everything and flying around in a metal tube all the time. But yeah, it's you've got to be tuned into what's most fulfilling, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that's kind of fulfilling, right? Like, I'd like to have some of that. Well, yeah, but there's an opportunity cost for that, right?
Do you speak as much as you used to? I know we're back up and running.
Yeah,
the world is.
I don't actually. I used to do 30 or 40, events a year of different types. And this year I'm going to do, if you include leadership team offsites, I'll probably do 8,
That's a massive change.
Yeah, it is.
And so at the risk of asking the obvious question, what accounts for the change? Because you could go back to 30 or 40 if you wanted to.
I guess. Yeah. I think just getting more and more clear about what I find fulfilling now, and going deeper with a few rather than broader with a bunch, I find more fulfilling because you're around long enough to see the impact, and you develop a deeper relationship with the people you're working with, which is really important to me, probably at this point in my life, more than it was when I was younger. The speeches are fun, and I think they probably do some good, but you never really know what happens after it, right? Because, it's like, good luck and see you, hope it works okay. And, you get a little bit of feedback maybe after the event through surveys or whatever, but you don't get to literally see and be with the folks as they're acting on what you shared, or thinking more about the question you asked and doing something about what they came up with based on that question. And so, I just find that a lot more fulfilling. I'm like you, I'm starting a podcast. Well, you've started yours. I'm working on starting a podcast. So that's the big project for this year. And I'm finding that engrossing and a lot of fun and way harder than I thought it would be.
I think that'll be great. Would you do a mix of, like we do a mix of thought leadership and guests? It's about 50-50, Gary and I talking and guests. I mean, would you do a mix of both? Or? Yeah,
so the podcast is called Best Ever, and it's going to launch this summer. And it's conversations with notable leaders from different fields, business, nonprofit, public sector, all 3 in season 1, about their lessons learned on the intersection between effective self-management and positive leadership outcomes. So it's really very aligned with the whole Life GPS thing, because that's my biggest passion. I am just fascinated by what people do to help themselves be the best they can be and what the impact of that is in different aspects of their life, their life at work, their life at home, their life in their broader community. So I'm really excited about the guests that we've been able to line up for season 1, and already thinking about season 2. We haven't even launched season 1. So.
That's awesome. So as we sort of begin to sum up, I mean, how would you sum up your kind of life's work? You've got mindfulness, you've got, at least in my words, sort of living life on purpose, physical, mental, relational, spiritual routines, rhythms. How would you sort of sum up what your passion is, what your life's work is?
That's you think I'd have an answer to that question since after all this conversation. I don't have a succinct answer. I love helping people self-reflect, and being a resource to them in that way. I've reached the point in my life where I'm much happier about my clients' success than I am my own. And I think that's really a true thing. I'll be honest. I mean, you mentioned in the intro, like the Thinkers 50 list that I'm on and the Global Gurus thing and stuff, and that's cool. But I almost feel like at this point, it's like a Lifetime Achievement Award or something. It's like, Kirk Douglas never really won an Oscar, but here's his Lifetime Achievement Oscar, and it's nice, but it's coming at a time in my life, in my career, where it doesn't matter as much to me as it would have when I was in my 30s or 40s, because then it would have been like a huge business development lever, but it's like, I don't really care about that. I mean, don't get me wrong, folks that are listening, I still like working with clients, but I just, like I said earlier, I love building the relationships with folks where, there's a book years ago from David Maister, The Trusted Advisor. I like being that person. I like being the trusted advisor, the trusted confidant, the friend, and not just with paying clients, but just in general. I like having those conversations, and I just find that really fulfilling. And I like being on the receiving end of those too, which is what this has been. So thank you for that.
Scott, since you mentioned landing the plane, I'll say that sound you just heard, folks, was the captain turning on the fasten seatbelt sign, indicating we've begun our descent to land the plane on this conversation. But before we do that, I would be remiss if I didn't give you the opportunity to let people know where they can find you online. And you mentioned something about if they find you online, they can get a downloadable, fillable Life GPS.
Fill it in, editable. Yeah. So sure, eblingroup.com, like my last name, E as in Echo, B as in Bravo, L as in Lima, I as in Ida, N as in November. Always have to spell it. Eblingroup.com. And if you go to the resources page there's a bunch of stuff. But one of the things there is the Life GPS downloadable worksheet. And then you can type it up for yourself if you choose to. There's also a Life GPS personal planner there that has a little 16-page little 16 question, not 16 pages. That would be too long. 16 question self-assessment that's sort of keyed to the Overworked and Overwhelmed book and the Life GPS framework, just to kind of see what your starting point is in your own assessment, and then gives you a little bit of guidance on where to dive deeper in the book if you want some additional food for thought on that as you get started. So that's what I mentioned. And then it's not on there yet, but in the coming months, there will be a blog link on our website for the Best Ever podcast. And check back in, please. Sign up for my mailing list, and we'll let you know when the blog is officially launching. And I hope everybody listening to yours will, as they say online, like and follow
exactly
our podcast on Spotify or YouTube or whatever.
So, Warwick, I will flip it back to you for the last question or questions. I'm going to go run off and download the Life GPS, and I'll stay here. I'm going to do it.
Good job out of you.
I'm going to do it right after we finish this episode, but take it away.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Scott. What a wonderful conversation. And, we talk a lot about Beyond the Crucible, that there might be people listening and maybe today's their worst day. Maybe they're in the pit. Maybe they've got an adverse health diagnosis. Maybe they've lost a loved one. Maybe their marriage is breaking up. I mean, it could be all sorts of crucible. And they might be in a pretty bad way. What would a word of hope be for that person if today was their worst day? 2 words.
It's temporary. The experience you have right now is not the experience that you're going to have for the rest of your life. I like your idea about not being defined by your worst day. We get to recreate ourselves whenever we choose to, right? And so, yeah, that's it. Just don't believe the falsity that whatever is hard right now is always going to be your condition going forward. 5% solution. There's little things you can do every day that can make it better and better. And sometimes you may not see the progress, but just believe and know that you're making progress, because you are.
Folks, I've been in the communications business long enough to know when the last word on the subject's been spoken, and our guest Scott Eblin just spoke it. So, Warwick, we just finished our interview with Scott Eblin, and it ranks up there in the one of the top interviews. Just for me, watching you, we're so engaged in that one. You're always engaged with our guests, right. But I think you found a lot of affinity with him. So what was the thing that Scott had to say? What were the points that Scott had to make that really resonated with you that you want to make sure that our listeners and viewers take away from this discussion?
Yeah, Gary, so many leaders, so many people are they're running on this treadmill, like, a little, gerbil on a treadmill, it's like, why are you going so fast? Well, I don't know, everybody else is. And I use the image of the anthill that somebody wrote about. It's like, well, where's everybody going? I don't know. It must be good because I keep climbing.
Right.
You can have this sort of thought as you go onward and upward in your career that you just never stop. And what I love about what Scott Eblin said is he talked about mindfulness really being the key, which he defines as awareness plus intention. So really, just sitting back and saying, well, what do I want my life to be about? later on in the book that we talked a lot about, which is Overworked and Overwhelmed, the Mindfulness Alternative, which Scott wrote. He talks about a life GPS. It's really being aware of, what do you want out of life? What does life look like when it's at its best? What do you look like when your life is, when you're at your best? And so just being mindful rather than just responding to the next email, the next crisis, think about, well, what do I want my life to be about? And that really ties so well with what we talk about at Beyond the Crucible, which is, we believe the end goal in life is to lead a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. So what's my on purpose? What does that look like for me? And if you feel like, well, I don't know, I'm just living somebody else's vision, somebody else's dream, maybe my bosses or my family's, I'm living up to other people's expectations. Well, are you living somebody else's life or your life? So to be able to do that, you definitely need some mindfulness to stop back and be aware of, where am I leading my life? Is it the life I want to live or somebody else's? If it's somebody else's, let me start being intentional, saying, okay, what's one step towards getting my life on track? My track, not somebody else's track.
Right.
And that's not going to happen overnight. It will take, as Scott said, 5% increments before sometimes you get a huge push forward. Those 5%, sometimes they can be a game-changing moment. But just being mindful and aware of where are you in life, why are you where you are, and
I want to say one thing in the time we have left here. I want to say one thing to the viewers. Don't be don't be scared by the word mindfulness, right? That's sort of the word du jour in the culture right now, in the personal development space in particular. But what he's really talking about, right, Warwick, is just kind of being intentional, thinking through the things that we're doing, the taking captive the thoughts that we're having and putting them towards sort of advancing the goals we want to advance. That's sort of a fair estimate, but we shouldn't be afraid of that word mindfulness, should we?
Absolutely. For some, and certainly for Scott, yoga has been very helpful. That's certainly a tool and approach, but there are, other approaches, other tools. So, think of mindfulness in a broader category, as you're saying, is, what are the things that you need to do to be aware? Think of self-awareness. How can you be self-aware of your life? Do you like where your life is headed? Do you like the relationships you're with? Are they serving you? Like, you could have friends that are sarcastic and pull you down. Is that serving you? Maybe a little less sarcasm. Maybe being with friends that uplift you more would be better. So just be aware of where you're hanging out, what you're doing, why you're doing what you're doing, and just be mindful of what are the rhythms in your life that help you operate at your best, whether it's exercise, food, prayer, meditation, just being still, looking out the window on a beautiful sunny day, whatever it takes. So think of mindfulness as really being self-aware about who you are, where you're headed, and what are the kind of things that help you operate at your best self and help you recharge your battery. So think of it in pretty simple, practical terms like that, rather than, what does mindfulness mean? Do I need to have a candle, or do I need to, be in a blue room or a red room, or wear special clothes? Or no, That's not really the point. It's just, what mindful techniques work for you? How can you operate at your best? What does it look like for you to be self-aware? Just think of it in very practical terms.
Right. And we can, even at Beyond the Crucible, right, we can take mindfulness and sort of place it along the Beyond the Crucible roadmap, right? Is that not, as you've just described it, kind of self-reflection, right? That's kind of what we talk about the actionable truth that will help you move from trial to triumph. Self-reflection's it, mindfulness, same sort of concept, right?
That's one of our actionable truths, self-reflection. So it's part of the journey to go from trial to triumph, from your worst day to a life of significance. It's a critical step. You don't get beyond your worst day without self-reflection. So being self-aware, self-reflection is an important tool that's absolutely critical.
So until the next time we're together, please remember to do a couple things for us, if you would. One, if you're watching us on YouTube, leave a comment there. Tell us what you liked about this conversation, what you like about the show in general. Also, if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, we'd ask you to leave a review, hopefully a good review. You can also email us at info@beyondthecrucible.com if there are guests you think we should have, if there are topics you want us to explore, if there are things you want to tell us, you can do that as well. And until the next time we are together, please remember this. We know your crucible experiences are difficult. Scott talked about a few crucible experiences he had that were difficult. Warwick's talked about his. I've talked about mine. We know they're difficult, but we also know this. And Scott just said it at the end. Almost everything is temporary. We know they're not the end of your story. If you learn the lessons from your crucible and you take the steps, those small steps that Scott talked about, that Warwick often talks about, those small steps to move beyond your crucible, it can take you to a new destination that can be the best destination you could ever reach. And that is a life of significance. Welcome to a journey of transformation with the Beyond the Crucible assessment. Unlike any other, this tool is designed to guide you from adversity to achievement. As you answer a few insightful questions, you won't just find a label like the helper or the individualist. Instead, you'll uncover your unique position in the journey of resilience. This assessment reveals where you stand today, the direction you should aim for, and crucially, the steps to get there. It's more than an assessment. It's a roadmap to a life of significance. Ready? Visit beyondthecrucible.com. Take the free assessment and start charting your course to a life of significance today.